Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my opinion on the best junglers for patch 6.1. First up is going to be Kindred. Right now, Kindred is a very strong pick for solo queue as long as you can play her correctly. In my opinion, she is harder to play than a lot of the other junglers in the game due to her ultimate being a very unique ability, and it's hard to judge when to use Kindred's ultimate in certain situations. I feel that if you can get a good Kindred ult off in a team fight, then that could just win you the game, but it can also end up losing you the game in certain situations if you use it and it ends up saving the enemy champion. So I think that as long as you know how to kite around well with Kindred and you can use your ultimate in the right situation, then she can be a very successful pick for sure. She's got great mobility in her kit with her Q. Her clear speeds are actually quite strong in the jungle as well, and her ganks, they're actually not that bad. You'd think that a jungler who doesn't have a stun or a fear or any hard CC would not have the best ganks, but as long as you've got red buff, then you can do, your ganks can be very good on Kindred. Her ultimate is really strong if you can use it in the right situation, like I said before, but if you do end up using it in the wrong situation, then it could end up winning the enemy team the game. She does scale really well into the late game as well due to her passive dealing that percentage health damage. And a few cons to Kindred though is that she is a squishier jungler, so if you're lacking a tank on your team, then picking Kindred to round out your comp would not be the best idea. And she also doesn't have any strong CC, so if your team is lacking a tank or a champion that does have CC, then I would recommend picking one of the other junglers on my list. Next on my list, I have Elise. So like Kindred, Elise, in my opinion, is a bit harder to play than some of the other junglers. She does rely on hitting her cocoon in the early game to pull off successful ganks. However, if you can hit your cocoon and you just know how to play Elise correctly, you look for tower dives in the early game and you look to take advantage of your strong early game, then you can be very successful on her. She's got really good clear speeds in the jungle because she does have 4 abilities, 2 in human form, and then she does have 2 damaging abilities in spider form as well, so it just allows her to clear the jungle really quickly. Her ganks are very good as well if you can hit your cocoon. Her tower diving ability in the early game is great as well. I think that's one of the main things that differentiates a really good Elise player from an average Elise player. A great Elise player will look for tower dives in the early game and she'll repel in the right situation and she'll tank tower shots, whereas an average Elise player, she'll never look for those tower dives in the early game. She's also a great duelist, especially if she can hit her cocoon. If she ends up catching her opponent out with the cocoon, then she's basically guaranteed to win that duel. She is an AP bruiser, so you really, when I play Elise, I like to go a few damage items on her. I'll build the jungle damage item, and then I'll usually go Rylai's after that, and then depending on what my team comp needs, if we need tank, then I'll just end up building tank after that. But if you end up going full AP Elise, it's pretty crazy. So if your team is lacking damage, then picking Elise for that situation actually isn't all that bad of an idea. And one con to her though is that she is a bit harder to play than some of the other junglers. Next up I have Jax. So Jax's late game is just one of the most insane champions in the game. His early game isn't as strong as some of the other junglers like Elise and like Kindred, but once you do get your Sated Devourer on Jax, and once you get a few items after that, you can just end up 1v2ing, 1v3ing, and it's just so hard to shut down a Jax once he does get to mid to late game. He's a really good duelist because of his dodge. I would recommend picking Jax if the enemy team does pick an auto attack based jungler like a Master Yi or an Udyr. Jax is really good against those champions due to his dodge. He also does have the auto attack reset with his jungle, or with his W, which allows him to clear the jungle pretty well. He does mixed damage as well, so it's just so hard for the enemies to build against him. He does actually have some pretty good early game presence too. As long as he can get his stun off, then he can pull off some pretty good ganks in the early game. And a few cons to Jax though is that his early game isn't as strong as some of the other junglers, and his first clear in the early game isn't all that good either. Next up I have Rengar. So Rengar is a great pick in the situation where your team is lacking damage and you just need someone that can end up bursting down the enemy AD carry. He's not the best pick if your team is lacking a tank or if you're lacking crowd control, but if your team does need damage, I would definitely recommend picking Rengar. He's also a really good pick against mobile squishy champions like Misfortune is one of the most played AD carries right now. We're seeing Lux a lot in the mid lane, so if the enemy team does lock those champions, then I would definitely recommend recommend picking Rengar in that situation as well. His burst is really crazy and he does snowball really hard as well. Once you do get going on Rengar, then you can end up one-shotting the enemy AD carry in the mid to late game. His level 6 ganks are some of the best in the game as well, since he can lane gank, and a lot of other junglers in the game, maybe besides Rammus, can't lane gank, so that just makes Rengar really unique, and it just allows him to pull off some really successful ganks at level 6. His passive is also really good for invading in the jungle and just for catching his opponents out, and his root that he has on his E is actually pretty strong for ganks in the early game. It's a 1.75 second root, so as long as you can hit that when you do gank, you should be able to at least burn the enemy's flash. And one con to Rengar though is that he is very weak if he does fall behind, since he doesn't have any strong crowd control and he doesn't build tank either. So if you fall behind as Rengar, then you're just going to be really squishy and you're not really going to be able to do much in team fights. And to round out my top 5 for this patch, I have the unkillable beast Mundo. So if Mundo isn't banned, definitely look to insta-lock him. He's still one of the strongest champions in the game right now. I'm really surprised he didn't receive a nerf this patch actually, just because of how successful he's been in solo queue and how high of a win rate that he does have. Once you do get to mid to late game as Mundo, you're pretty much unkillable. If you end up picking up a Warmogs, you're going to be regenning for so much HP, and then you've got your ultimate on top of that as well, so he's just so hard to kill in those mid to late game team fights. His ganks in the early game actually aren't all that bad either. If you end up hitting your first Q on your opponent, you're gonna force them to flash if they are pushed out a little bit, because once you hit the first Q, if they don't flash, then you're gonna be able to hit another Q after that. And he also does do a lot of damage for a tanky champion. You don't even need to build a damage item on Mundo, and you can still end up 1v1ing like a lot of the champions in the game. A few cons to Mundo though is that he is weaker than some of the other junglers in the early game, so if you are playing up against a Mundo and he is looking to go jungle, then I would recommend playing a strong early game jungler like an Elise or a Rengar and look to invade him in the early game, because he definitely isn't the best duelist in the early game. And also, if you're a good Vayne player, I would recommend picking her against Mundo, since she does do the true damage, and also make sure somebody on your team does end up taking Ignite, so then it will reduce the healing from his ultimate. So first on the honorable mentions, I have Nidalee. Nidalee is a very skilled champion. She does rely on hitting her Q in the early game to pull off successful ganks, but if you can play Nidalee correctly, I definitely think she is a very strong jungler, and she does benefit from these changes to the Runix Echo this patch, so if you are a good Nidalee player, then definitely look to play her this patch. Next, I have Khazix. So the buffs that Khazix got this patch are actually quite good. You wouldn't think that 100 range on his leap would matter all that much, but it makes his early game ganks a lot stronger now. He is weaker though still if he does fall behind, so you gotta make sure that you do have a strong early game as Khazix. Look to invade the enemy jungler if they are a weaker early game jungler, and just try to take advantage of his stronger early game, and then you should definitely have some good success on Khazix this patch. Next up, I have Fiddle. So Fiddle is one of the AP junglers who benefited the most from the changes to the AP jungle item. He was really crappy with the Sheen since he really didn't auto attack that much, but with the item being changed to the Luden's Echo proc now, it just makes him a much stronger pick, and I definitely think that he's going to be one of the stronger junglers this patch. Next up, I have Rammus. So Rammus was one of the strongest junglers in the game last patch, but I do think that this patch, he has fallen off a little bit. He is still really good if the enemy team does have an AD jungler like a Rengar, or if they do have an AD mid laner like a Zed, someone that you can just easily taunt when they try to jump in on your backline in a team fight. But with the AP jungle item changes this patch, we're going to be seeing a lot more AP junglers played, and Rammus isn't all that great if he can't end up building full armor, so I think he's still a good pick in the right situation, but you're not going to want to pick him every game like you would last patch. Next up is Poppy. So Poppy is a really good CC tank jungler, so if your team is lacking that, then picking her in that situation would not be a bad choice at all. She really doesn't even need to build any damage items. You can just go full tank Poppy, and because of her high base damages on her ability, she can actually still put out a good amount of damage in team fights. She's got good crowd control as well with her E and her ultimate, so if your team is lacking disengage, then I would definitely recommend picking her in that situation. Next up, I have Lee Sin. So Lee Sin definitely is harder to play than most of the other junglers in the game. I would say if you played him a lot and you're skilled on him, then definitely look to pick him up. But if you're new to Lee Sin or you haven't played a lot of games on him, then I'd stay away from him, since he does have a lot of different combos that he can use. And if you don't know how to play him correctly in the early game, then he falls off pretty hard in the mid to late game. And there are definitely other stronger junglers than him once you do get to that point in the game. Next, I have Graves. So Graves does a ton of damage. If that's your kind of playstyle, then I would definitely recommend playing him. He doesn't provide any strong crowd control though, so if your team is lacking that, or if your team is lacking a tank, then picking him to round out your comp in that situation wouldn't be the best option. However, if your team is lacking damage, then picking him would be a very good choice for sure. And last but not least on the RO mentions for this video, I have Tahm Kench. So Tahm Kench is also a really good tank jungler. He's really annoying to play against due to his thick skin and just due to the fact that he's got really strong single target crowd control. So if your team is lacking a tank, then I would recommend picking Tahm in that situation. So that's going to be it for the video, guys. If you did enjoy, then don't forget to drop a like and subscribe if you have not already. So thanks for watching, guys. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.